Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Robert Golden, Dean of the School of Medicine and Public Health here at the University of Wisconsin. I want to welcome you to our 2021 Wisconsin Medicine Livestream series. We will be bringing you this program every other Wednesday evening, now through June. Tonight's program focuses on advances in asthma. Asthma is the most common chronic lung disease affecting 7 to 10% of children and adults. It has increased over the past 20 years for reasons that remain unclear. While it remains an important precipitant of respiratory distress and hospitalization, new insights into its causes and pathophysiology have led to more effective treatments and renewed hope for preventive strategies. Tonight, our three speakers from the UW Asthma Research Program will discuss the causes of childhood asthma, as well as innovative treatment strategies and new concepts relating to asthma and to other chronic diseases in adults. It's really a pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. James Gurn. Dr. Gurn is a professor in the Division of Allergy, Immunology, and Rheumatology in the Department of Pediatrics, and also an affiliate faculty member in the Division of Allergy, Pulmonary, and Critical Care Medicine in our Department of Medicine here at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. Welcome, Dr. Gurn.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob. So we're going to go ahead to the first slide here. So as Bob said, asthma is a disease of the airways. It's a chronic disease that primarily affects the airways or breathing tubes. And you can see on the left, there's an airway that's wide open. It has a wall, it has a lumen, so air can easily go in and out. If you look at the airway on the right, this represents an airway in asthma. And what you can see is that the wall is thickened and you have some mucus in the airway. And this leads to obstruction, so it's difficult for air to move in and out, and this can get episodically worse during asthma attacks. So we'll go to the next slide. So I'm going to address what causes asthma. Again, as a lung disease, we know that the development of the lungs begins during the prenatal period, and there certainly are some genetic predispositions for asthma, but also the environment during the pregnancy is very important. And we know that things like maternal nutrition and tobacco smoke exposure are important in determining the risk for children to go on to develop asthma. In infancy, the most common manifestation of asthma are acute wheezing episodes that can be precipitated by viral infections, and also by exposure to allergens in children who are developing allergies. So children who have wheezing and develop allergies are very likely to go on to develop chronic asthma. And then once children have asthma, once this has been established, we'll click one more time, these same environmental factors, so respiratory viruses and exposure to allergens in children who have allergies, lead to acute asthma attacks or exacerbations. So this suggests that if we could do something about these viruses that cause the early wheezing episodes and these asthma attacks, we really might be able to prevent asthma and to prevent asthma exacerbations. So one more click. It turns out that most of these respiratory viruses that cause these wheezing episodes in young children and in children with asthma are rhinoviruses. So they're closely related to asthma at all ages. And the conundrum here is that these are common cold viruses. So for most people, these viruses really don't cause much in the way of trouble, but they're responsible for many cases of hospitalization in infants and exacerbations. If we go to the next slide, it turns out that there's a rich history of rhinovirus research at the UW-Madison. And this started back in the 1970s with Elliot Dick, who is an epidemiologist studying inoculation and transmission of rhinoviruses, Roland Record, a brilliant molecular virologist who worked out the replication structure and genetics, and Bill Bussey, who's one of our speakers today, did some seminal work on understanding how rhinoviruses lead to asthma exacerbations. Rob Lemansky and Dan Jackson, one of our other speakers tonight, really linked early life wheezing episodes with rhinovirus to the onset of asthma. Then Wai-Ming Lee in my laboratory was one of the first to discover a new species of rhinovirus that's very closely connected to these early life wheezing episodes. This work is continuing to this day with Ann Palmenberg, working on rhinovirus C structure and inhibitors. She's developed the first inhibitors. And Yuri Bachkov in my laboratory, who's studying rhinovirus growth and discovered the receptor for rhinoviruses and is now working on the first common cold vaccine. If we go to the next slide. So our goal is to develop treatments for rhinovirus to see if we can prevent wheezing and asthma. And this involves three key areas of discovery. Number one, can we identify the children who are at risk for these wheezing episodes with these common cold viruses? Number two, which viruses do we target? And then three, is a vaccine feasible? So we'll go to the next slide. So we've made great progress in identifying children at risk, and this starts with genetics. It turns out that the receptor for rhinovirus is a protein called CDHR3, and there are two genetically determined forms of this, the C529 and the Y529, that have different structures, and actually more of the Y529 gets on the surface of cells, so this becomes a risk factor for rhinovirus C infections and also acute wheezing illnesses. And then from a number of different birth cohort and epidemiologic studies, if we click one more time, we've identified a number of other risk factors. So rhinovirus C in particular is a stimulus for wheezing in preschoolers, in minority children, children who have a history of wheezing, and as I mentioned before, children with a family history of asthma, and children with allergy. So if we go to the next slide, the second area of discovery is which viruses to target. And some of you may be wondering, you know, coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2 was discovered just a couple of years ago, and now we have a vaccine. You know, what's taken you guys so long? It's been 50 years. Well, this is the family tree for rhinoviruses, and there's about 180 separate viruses in this family. So this is a real challenge for prevention and for development of a vaccine. But again, we've made some progress with this through some large epidemiologic studies. Click again. We found that the B viruses, these are the ones in blue, are really unimportant. They rarely cause wheezing episodes. Whereas the green viruses, these are the C viruses that were recently discovered, are really important for causing wheezing illnesses. We've also identified some of these viruses are more common. Some of these viruses are more virulent, so they're more likely to cause wheezing illness. And importantly, there seems to be a characteristic of rhinovirus C where we suspected that some of the viruses may be cross-neutralizing, which means you get infected with one virus and then you get protected against several viruses. Go to the next slide. So the third question, is a vaccine feasible? And in fact, there's been feasibility demonstrated in animal models. There was a prototype vaccine developed at Emory University with 50 different rhinovirus strains, which showed protective antibody in both mice and monkeys. And Yuri Bachkov has put together a vaccine with rhinovirus C types, the ones that are very closely connected with childhood asthma. And with 9 of these strains, he got protective antibody for all 9 strains in a mouse model. The data on the right, the graph on the right, represents data from children. And it's a very interesting phenomenon here where these rhinovirus C infections seem to induce particularly long-lasting antibody protection in children. So you can see on the x-axis the age in years, and what we did was to follow these children during their childhood and look at blood specimens to see how many of them were protected against rhinovirus C viruses. And what you can see is that for rhinovirus A, the level of protection goes up with time, but it's relatively low. And at rhinovirus C, for all ages, it's about 3 times more likely for these children to be immune to rhinovirus C, suggesting that it's particularly immunogenic, which is really good in terms of vaccine prospects. So go to the next slide. So we're really left with this quote from Albert Einstein: everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. We know there are about 57 different rhinovirus C types in nature. The big question right now, and what we're working on in our research program, is how many rhinovirus C types does it take to make a vaccine that will be broadly protective? So go to the final slide here, and I just want to acknowledge the research team. The vaccine work is being led by Yuri Bochkov. Dan Jackson and Bill Bussey have made significant contributions, and you're about to hear from them. And in the Institute of Molecular Virology on campus, Dr. Ann Palmenberg. You can see the different studies that have been highlighted today with funding from the National Institute of Health and also the School of Medicine and Public Health. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. That was really interesting. I really appreciate the way you and your team are focusing upstream, identifying in early childhood those kids that are at risk, and then really trying to make a difference in terms of interventions that can prevent chronic asthma. And that just seems to be the best traditions of combining medicine and public health prevention with diagnosis and treatment. Well, now it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Dan Jackson. Dr. Jackson is an associate professor in the Division of Allergy, Immunology, and Rheumatology in our Department of Pediatrics, and an affiliated faculty member in the Division of Allergy, Pulmonary, and Critical Care Medicine in our Department of Medicine. He also is a recent past president, a remarkably effective past president of our Wisconsin Medical Alumni Association. So please join me in welcoming Dan Jackson.
Thank you, Dean Golden. Really delighted to be here tonight, and I'll be talking about recent advances in the treatment of childhood asthma. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to focus on this evening is the importance of asthma exacerbations, also known as asthma attacks. So these common events really are the primary source of morbidity and mortality in asthma. They lead to major healthcare costs, lost time from school and work, and importantly, are most common in urban minority populations and really evidence of disparity for these populations. Furthermore, they can lead to progressive loss of lung function over time and an associated increased disease severity over time as well. And importantly, they often occur despite the regular use of controller therapies such as inhaled corticosteroids. Next slide. So when we think about asthma exacerbations or asthma attacks, I think it's important to highlight the link between colds and asthma exacerbations. So when we think about children, anywhere from 65 to 90% of asthma attacks in children are associated with respiratory viral infections. And rhinoviruses, as Dr. Gurn just talked about, are actually the most common cause. However, it's also important to note that not all colds actually progress to asthma exacerbations, even in children with moderate to severe asthma. So this highlights a couple things. One, we need to understand which colds will go on to exacerbation and how we can prevent it. Next slide. When we think about approaches to attempt to prevent asthma exacerbations, this schematic goes through a potential exacerbation that a child might encounter with a cold. The blue line is showing the days from the start of a cold, and with progressively increasing symptoms from the green zone where the child's doing well, to the yellow zone where things aren't going so well, to the red zone where they have an asthma attack, and then progressing back down to their baseline steady state. Next click. What we want to do is attenuate that line. So this black dashed line that I'm showing here is showing the goal of trying to lessen the peak severity of symptoms and returning that child back to their baseline state of health more quickly. Next. So there's a variety of ways that we can approach this. One is with long-term, what we term controller therapy, which inhaled corticosteroids are the most common long-term controller therapy that we use. Next. There also are approaches that are termed yellow zone approaches, or a step up in the short term, where once a child starts to develop cold symptoms or an escalation in their asthma symptoms, we do something else to intervene to try and prevent an exacerbation. And I'll go through a few examples of this in upcoming slides. Next slide, please. So the first thing I'm going to talk about are, can patient characteristics be used to individualize treatment to prevent asthma exacerbations? Next slide. One study that we performed within AsthmaNet, which is a asthma network which was funded by the NHLBI within the National Institutes of Health, identified peripheral blood eosinophils. So this is a particular cell that's important in some patients with asthma, particularly those with more of an allergic phenotype to their asthma. And what we found is that the number of the peripheral blood eosinophils that a child had really predicted response to therapy in these children. On the left side of the figure, you can see in the children that had low levels of eosinophils, whether we used a daily inhaled corticosteroid, an as-needed inhaled corticosteroid, or a daily leukotriene receptor antagonist, which is another controller treatment for asthma, really, it didn't make a difference which 3 treatments we used in terms of the probability of a child doing best with that treatment. Whereas in children with this easily identifiable blood marker of elevated blood eosinophils, on the right side of the screen, you can see that those treated with a daily inhaled corticosteroid were much more likely to do best if they were treated with that daily inhaled corticosteroid versus one of the other 2 treatments. Next slide. However, despite this, even when we identify that best treatment, a lot of times children can still have exacerbations. And so this has led to the question, is more better? Can escalation of an inhaled corticosteroid dose at the onset of a cold prevent an asthma exacerbation? Next slide. What we found was that even quintupling the dose of inhaled corticosteroid, so 5 times the dose when a child entered the yellow zone, does not actually reduce asthma exacerbations. So in the table here, you can see that the children who had 5 times the dose actually had numerically more exacerbations than those that were kept on the low dose when they entered that yellow zone. Furthermore, we saw that there were some mild growth effects in children that were exposed to that higher dose of ICS. So this study, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, really highlighted the fact that more targeted approaches are clearly needed to prevent asthma exacerbations in children. Next slide. So in order to identify those different interventions, I think it's important to ask the question, what immune pathways underlie colds that progress to asthma exacerbations? Next slide. So this is a rather complicated figure, but I think that it actually highlights the complexity of the immune pathways that actually lead to a viral asthma exacerbation. And what you're seeing as you progress from left to right in the slide is the exacerbation progression over time from when the child first encounters that viral trigger and they develop the infection in their airways. And what you can see is that in children that go on to an exacerbation, a lot of times we see this exaggerated type 2 or allergic type inflammation early on within that illness. And then as you progress along with these other pathways activated, you see these factors in green on the right side of the screen where we see a lot of extra mucus produced. We see activation of those eosinophils, that cell that I was talking about earlier. And we also see activation of pathways that can lead to airway remodeling, which we think are important consequences of the exacerbation. So all of this put together suggests that there are a variety of different ways that we might be able to intervene in order to prevent exacerbations. Next slide. So I'll highlight on the next couple slides a proof of concept of how an intervention directed at allergic inflammation can actually prevent asthma exacerbations. Next slide. So this study comes from the Intercity Asthma Consortium, funded by the NIH as well, and looks at omalizumab, or anti-IgE, in urban children with exacerbation-prone asthma. So omalizumab is a monoclonal antibody that's been approved for the last 20 years for adults with severe allergic asthma, and more recently for children. And what it does is block the allergic response. So the question here was, if we can block that allergic response when a child encounters a viral infection, could that actually reduce the subsequent illness severity and the risk of exacerbation? And to study this, we looked at the PROSE study, which looked at seasonal treatment of children with exacerbation-prone asthma with omalizumab starting before the very high-risk fall season. Next slide. And indeed, what we found was that blocking allergic responses prevents exacerbations. So we saw fewer asthma exacerbations, a reduction of about 50%. While this is a very significant reduction, it also highlights the complexity that I showed you on the earlier slides of other factors that can lead to exacerbation and other opportunities to prevent exacerbation. Additionally, we saw that the omalizumab reduced the rhinovirus infections and also the duration of the rhinovirus infections. And importantly, mechanistically identified that treating this type 2 inflammation or allergic inflammation with omalizumab actually led to enhancement of the antiviral responses. So it actually helped the child fight the viral infection to prevent the exacerbation. I'll go to the next slide. So I'm going to stop here and just highlight the many people involved to make these multi-center clinical research trials possible. Those that have been collaborators with us within AsthmaNet, funded by NHLBI, as well as the Inner-City Asthma Consortium, funded by NIAID. And certainly great thanks to all of our study participants, study coordinators, and staff that made all these studies possible as well.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. You know, I really love the way your work really highlights the need for collaboration, that it really takes a global village with all of your participating partners across the United States to do this type of really meaningful but very large-scale population-based research. And I also love the way your work and Jim's work and Bill's work, your entire group's approach highlights how working towards a deeper understanding of basic biology is a very promising pathway for clinical interventions and clinical relevance. Well, our final researcher this evening is Dr. Bill Bussey. Dr. Bussey is a professor of medicine in the Division of Allergy, Pulmonary, and Critical Care Medicine at our school, and he is also the former chair of our Department of Medicine, as well as an internationally renowned leader in asthma research, who led the creation of our asthma program from the start and has served now as a mentor for several generations of leaders in the field. Welcome, Bill. It's great to see you.
Bob, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight. I'm going to continue by describing some of the advances in asthma that are occurring at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. And the question I'm going to direct our attention to is why asthma is more than asthma in for some patients. Next, as Dr. Gurn described initially, asthma is a disease of the airway, and a factor that is driving the disease is inflammation that occurs in the airway. Next, when this happens in a patient with asthma, it affects lung function. It leads to symptoms, risk for exacerbations, as Dan Jackson talked about, and if these events are allowed to go on for a long period of time, there can be progressive loss of lung function. Next, however, we are now seeing that asthma can have risks outside the lung. The metabolic syndrome, what happens with weight gain, alteration in sugar metabolism, is something that happens in severe asthma and has been described by Lauren Denlinger and Nazar Jarjour, who are part of the severe asthma research program run by the NIH. Cardiovascular disease also occurs at a higher incidence in patients with asthma. And Matt Tattersall in the Division of Cardiology is describing changes in blood vessels and risk for heart attacks in patients with asthma. There's another area in which asthma can have an effect outside the lung, and that is altering brain health. Depression has been known to be associated with asthma for a long time. It has often been felt to be part of the response to the burden of the disease and interfering with normal lifestyle. Recently, there has been data to suggest that asthma may also be a risk factor for dementia. Next, given this background, the research question we asked is, how does asthma affect brain health? Next. So the first question we asked ourselves was, does asthma directly communicate with the brain? Next. To do this, we set up the following model. We took patients with asthma, challenged them with an allergen to which they were allergic, and then looked at how it affected brain activity. And we found that when we provoked an episode of asthma, it actually activated areas of the brain, and these were neurocircuits that could regulate emotion. And this raises the possibility that alteration in emotions such as depression may be occurring directly from events that lead to asthma. Given the recent interest that asthma may also be a risk factor for dementia, we asked the question, may asthma also affect brain structure to cause neuroinflammation, neurodegeneration, and consequently be a risk for dementia? Next. So the question we asked and had the following answer. we found that asthma is associated with striking structural changes in the brain, and some of these are resembling neurodegeneration. On the left, you see two examples of a brain scan. The top one from the right to the left, and the other one just a cross-section across the brain. In patients with asthma, one sees striking changes in the white matter structure as indicated by the yellow and red colors. If you look on the right side, you see the variability in these alterations in structures in asthma compared to normals. And it indicates that not all individuals with asthma have these changes, but it is certainly greater than that which is seen in a normal population. It's also important to understand that none of these individuals had evidence of dementia or altered, functional activity of the brain. Next. So the next question we asked, given the fact that, again, these changes in structure are seen to a variable degree in patients with asthma, which asthma patients are more at risk for changes in brain structure? Well, we found out it is the patients who have severe asthma, who have a longer duration of asthma, which sort of suggests that this is a building up process. They require more medications to control asthma. Doesn't necessarily indicate that the medications are causing their changes in brain health, but it raises a question about severity of the disease. And importantly and interestingly, we also found that these patients had a positive blood test for an ultra-sensitive biomarker for Alzheimer's disease pathology. It's called GFAP, gliofibril acidic protein. And this is a blood test which marks an early step in the development of Alzheimer's. It doesn't mean that they have the disease or going to progress to the disease, but it raises the possibility that they may be in a situation where they're at a risk for dementia or Alzheimer's disease developing if this process is allowed to go on for a period of time. Next. So the next question we asked, what are the molecular mechanisms by which asthmatic inflammation activates the brain? And to do this, we did the following series of studies. As you can see on the right side, we did a test called the segmental allergen challenge. To do this, we use a bronchoscope, introduce it into the lung, into an airway of the lung, and deliver an antigen to which the individual is allergic. This sets up an acute inflammatory process in the lung. Then, as depicted on the left, we measure brain imaging, and we can then try to correlate events that are occurring in the lung and the airway with inflammation, with activation or alteration in normal activity of the brain. Next slide. The reason we use bronchoscopy is that we can retrieve fluid and cells from the lower airway at the time of this allergic inflammatory response. We can look at the cells involved. We can detect cytokines, which are a group of proteins which can direct inflammatory responses. And we can also measure gene expression networks. What are the genes that are activated, and what could the genes be that are associated with these events in the lung that are then signaling the brain? Next slide. Well, first of all, we found that there were many genes that were activated by this asthmatic inflammation, a large number of them. Some of them in relationship to the inflammatory response, as indicated by the red colors. Some of them had neuronal or nervous system differentiation effects. Some of them acted on the airway smooth muscle, which you would expect, and some of them acted on both of them. So there are a large number of genes that are activated in response to this stimulus for generating airway inflammation. Next slide. But the real question that we wanted to ask was, what patterns of gene expression could correlate with inflammation and also brain activation, and then may become a treatment target to prevent brain activation? Next. So what we did here was look at some of these proteins. As you can see on the vertical side, on the left-hand side of the slide, a variety of gene products that are associated with this inflammatory response. And on the horizontal component of this, we are looking at areas of the brain. Next. And we found that two pathways, the IL-10 and the IL-17 pathway, seem to be the most likely to be associated with both inflammation and activation in the brain. Next. So putting this together, we see the following relationship. On the horizontal part of the slide, we see the degree of brain activation. As numbers get larger, there's more activation. And on the vertical axis is the indication of asthmatic inflammation. And what this tells us is that activation and expression of these genes marking in asthmatic inflammation relates to the degree to which the brain is activated. It is an association, it's a correlation. It doesn't necessarily tell us the cause, but it suggests that events that are happening in the lung related to the asthmatic inflammatory response can be associated with events in the brain which can be related to an inflammatory response, and we can detect this by scanning. Next. So we are a School of Medicine and Public Health. I think one of the things that we need to do when we're doing these studies is ask the following question. What are the public health implications that asthma is a risk factor, a potential risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, and how may this relate to future research? Well, first of all, it's been indicated by Dean Golden, asthma affects a lot of people. 25 million patients in the United States have asthma, and this can be a disease that they have for a lifetime. Secondly, there are no treatments available at the present time to prevent Alzheimer's disease and the related dementia, which now affects 5 million people in the United States. So given this needed opportunity to reduce this large health burden on brain health, our research goals are the following. First of all, we need to verify that asthma is indeed a risk factor for dementia. Secondly, again, as I'd indicated already, this is not happening in every patient with asthma. We need to identify the at-risk asthma patients for neurodegeneration. And finally, we need to determine if more precise or precision treatment of asthmatic inflammation, that is some of the genes and gene products which are directing inflammation, if we can treat those, can we prevent the development of dementia and risk for Alzheimer's? This is a long-range, study, but it's very important given the large number of patients with asthma. And again, I think the tremendous health burden, both personal and society, that occurs with Alzheimer's disease or related dementia. Last slide. Again, this is acknowledgement. Studies like this do not go on with one person. It requires a research team, and it requires and benefits from funding from the NIH. What I've presented to you tonight is a collection of work from people from the Allergy and Pulmonary Group, psychology and psychiatry, Alzheimer's research, group, cardiology. We've also had collaborators at the University of Washington and the University of Gothenburg. And again, by working together as a team and addressing these apparently very different responses, asthma and brain health, I think we can get greater insight into the broad spectrum of how asthma can affect health, and also at the same time get greater understanding of disease mechanisms for an unrelated target, in this case, the brain. So thank you very much for your attention.
Wow, thank you, Bill. That was really fascinating. I guess we have to begin to think about asthma not as simply a lung disease, but as a brain disease and as a potentially preventable contributor to the horrible epidemic of Alzheimer's. So absolutely fascinating. I look forward to hearing about the next chapters in this unfolding story. Well, now we have time to share some questions that are already rolling in quite a bit. And I'm sure they will continue to roll in as we continue with the discussion. Not surprisingly, we've gotten a number of questions related to a topic that's been on everybody's mind for the last year, and that is the horrible COVID pandemic. And a number of folks want to know, can you tell us what we know at this point about the potential interaction and intersection between COVID and asthma? Dan, would you like to take a stab at that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I think it's certainly a timely and interesting question. And based on the information that Dr. Gurn and I went through tonight, showing the clear link between respiratory viruses and both the inception and exacerbation of asthma, when the pandemic first started, there was a lot of concern that COVID would dramatically impact patients with asthma, perhaps more so than others. And what has really proven to be fairly interesting is that asthma in general doesn't appear to be a major risk factor for severe COVID. One of the reasons for that is that a lot of what we talked about tonight is asthma as a single disease, but really asthma actually is multiple different diseases that present in the very same way with different underlying causes. And what we've seen is that particularly allergic asthma, which we also talked about a lot tonight, may actually alter your susceptibility to the COVID virus infection. So making it perhaps less likely that you could be infected because of that allergic inflammation in your airway. It all kind of evens out, and ultimately it's not like asthma appears to be protective for COVID, but it just doesn't seem to be a major risk factor like we would have expected.
Great, thank you. A number of questions for Dr. Gurn. I'm going to pick this one. Let's get back to the rhinoviruses. Are children specifically more susceptible to them? And also, is it possible to outgrow asthma over the course of one's lifetime by perhaps becoming naturally immune or vaccinated against the many types of rhinoviruses that are out there?
That's a great question. And it turns out that wheezing illnesses really do go down with age. So we see that virus wheezing illnesses are most common in preschool children, and then become much less common as children grow up if they don't have asthma. If they do have asthma, these wheezing illnesses triggered by respiratory viruses can actually be more common. So there you really see kind of a departure. The children without asthma are getting healthier. They're developing immunity and seem to be less likely to develop these virus-induced wheezing illnesses. Whereas children who develop asthma, particularly allergic asthma, continue to have problems with this. So you certainly can develop immunity to lots of different rhinoviruses. The problem is that there's 180 of them out there. And that's why, Bob, you and I and Bill and Dan are all still getting colds. It's because, we may be immune to 100 of them, but there's 180 of them, and 20 or 30 circulate in a community at any given time. So, it's just a tough virus to beat.
Yeah. Thank you. Bill, I want to direct a question to you. I'm sure all three of you could comment on this, but we've seen tonight about incredible continuum of research going from the molecular to the patient and then to the population. And we've also heard about amazing collaborations within UW, but also across the nation. So a lot of really important stuff, all of it synergistically adding to the other. How do we pay for this? How do we fund this really important asthma research?
This is the, should we say, the $64 million question. To do research costs money. There's no question about it. But to get started is also a difficult situation. You just can't write a grant without some information to base your activities on. So I think we've been very fortunate here at the University of Wisconsin. There are funds through the school, through other aspects, but these funds come about through philanthropy. I think having the availability of contributions to the medical school, to the university, provide sort of the kickstart for us being able to do this or to continue this effort. This is absolutely critical. And Bob, and better than anybody else, It's so important for the young investigator. They need to get a toehold. And here, this is the group of individuals with the new ideas, the new technology, the new levels of energy. They're the ones that need a support. And I think that this is an area that is tremendous need and just needs tremendous support.
Yeah, and Bob, if I could also add, I think those are just great points. One thing that the NIH, likes to see when you apply for a grant, they really want to believe that you can do what you say you can do. And that's wonderful, but it makes it a little bit hard to innovate. And the University of Wisconsin has always had wonderful programs to support innovation. So if you have an idea and you may not have a lot of information that proves that you can do this, but if it's a good idea, the University of Wisconsin has been there to help start those projects and to bring investigators together. I work very closely as a pediatrician with virologists, and funding from the university has really engendered and promoted those sorts of collaborative relationships across campus.
Well said. Thank you. Dan, another question for you has just come in. Can you talk a bit more about the urban and the environmental factors that impact the exacerbations in children and in general the prevalence of asthma in inner city environments? And in what way does public health and attention to environmental factors intersect with the medical care?
Yeah, so that's a really, really important question, and something that our group has continued to have a tremendous focus on as we move forward. Ultimately, children who grow up in urban environments are more likely to develop asthma. They're more likely to have severe disease, and they're more likely to have severe asthma attacks, so ending up hospitalized and unfortunately more likely to die from asthma. So there's a variety of factors that contribute to that. There are greater rates of pollution. There's greater rates of exposures associated with poor living conditions, greater stress, and a variety of other aspects that can contribute to that. So very complex question, but it's essential from a public health standpoint that we can mitigate those disparities if we address those underlying differences in those populations. But then furthermore, I think we have opportunities to develop new strategies, and that's what we're focused on within the Intercity Asthma Consortium, is to develop new strategies to either prevent disease from the beginning or modify how it goes over time for these children.
Thanks. Bill, here's a question from Elizabeth in Washington, who says that she still remembers things that you taught her in the 1970s. And Elizabeth in Washington wants to know, how often do people with chronic asthma as a age develop chronic obstructive pulmonary disease when they get older?
This is a very good question, Bob. And as Dan had alluded to, asthma is not one disease, it's multiple diseases. In answer to this question, patients with asthma will develop lung function changes which resemble what you tend to see in emphysema or chronic bronchitis, but it's different, Bob. It's different. It's the airway that has changed. And what's happening in some patients with asthma, and this has been newly recognized, I think, by many of us over the last 20 years, is the fact that asthma can lead to progressive loss of lung function. It's this inflammatory response that goes unchecked, and it tends to be a self-perpetuating process. And it's this injury repair which leads to chronic changes in the airway, which can be, at the present time, permanent.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say across the board, chronic inflammation is not good for any organ system. Well, thank you. Jim, here's a question I'd like to direct to you related to the use of steroid inhalers in kids. And I know sometimes the general public gets confused between the rescue inhalers versus that are used when needed versus the prescription of daily regular use of the steroids. And I think it was you who made reference to concerns about potential impact on growth in childhood. But can you talk a little bit about the long-term use of steroid inhalers and What are the risks and any ways to mitigate the risks?
Certainly. The decision to use a steroid inhaler to control asthma in a child, or for an adult for that matter, is a carefully considered decision, that depends on the state of asthma and also how the patient and the physician, feel that asthma can best be managed. But the bottom line is that when the burden of asthma becomes too high, and we measure that in terms of symptoms, in terms of waking up at nighttime, and in terms of exacerbations, the inhaled steroid is one of the best medications that we can use to intervene and really make a difference in those outcomes. So, on the plus side, Dan showed some data showing that they're very effective at reducing rates of exacerbations. They can control symptoms. They can lead to increases in lung function. On the risk side, especially in children, when children are growing, if you go above a certain dose of inhaled corticosteroid, you can start to see some effects on growth. Those effects are quite small. It's a half an inch over a lifetime, but they're measurable, and they can be of importance to some parents more than other parents, and it's something that needs to be recognized and discussed. We always monitor the growth of children when they're on an inhaled corticosteroid, because we know not everyone's the same. Most children have little or no effect on growth, and in others it's very important to detect if there is an effect, so you can rethink those decisions.
Okay, thanks. Dan, let me direct this one to you. If somebody's interested in participating in research, either as an asthma patient or as a healthy control that can help you unravel the pathophysiology, what are the practical ways in which they could get involved?
So there are a lot of ways to get involved, and the internet's a great way to find some of those opportunities. So in fact, if you go to one of your favorite search engines and type in UW asthma or UW asthma research, one of the top couple things will be the website for our Department of Medicine page that includes both pediatric and adult studies that are ongoing. We've got some new birth cohorts that are starting, so we're looking for pregnant moms to enroll into these studies, as well as a variety of other studies across the lifespan focused on disease prevention, best disease treatment, and in fact, for more severe patients, we have a study called PRECISE, which is looking at precision treatments for severe asthma. And that's led by my colleagues, Lauren Denlinger and Nizar Jarjour in the Department of Medicine.
Bob, if I could add something to this, I think first of all, we've been very fortunate that people are interested in and are participating in these studies. But talking to people that have participated, one of the benefits they get from this may not only be a new treatment that's effective, but they get a better understanding of the disease. The people that are working on these studies, they spend a lot of time with individuals. Participants learn more and more about their disease, and I think they leave, and they've told me this, I leave with a better understanding of the disease. And again, because it's a chronic disease, self-management is important, and they're just better informed, and I think their outcomes are going to be better over a long period of time.
Great. So I'm going to move on now to our last question of the evening, and I'd like to invite each of you to respond to this. I think that we've gotten a wonderful snapshot here of the incredible history of the asthma research program at the University of Wisconsin. It's an amazing story, but I really believe the best chapters are yet to be written. So I want to ask each of you, what makes you the most excited when you think about the future, let's say the next 10 years of asthma research and asthma treatment? And I'm going to start with one of the best historians that we could ask that question of, and that's Dr. Busse.
Bob, I think what we're looking for right at the present time is a cure or a prevention. We are getting, genetically, we understand some of the people that are at risk. We understand some of the factors that lead to the disease, and medications have been developed which are safe and effective in reducing the consequences of these very specific factors which lead to inflammation, like no other medications can do. And sometimes we feel if this is given early enough in the disease, we may not only prevent the consequences from it, but if we can identify the high-risk groups, we might be able to prevent the disease from ever expressing itself. I think this is certainly the hope for the future. Whether it's a decade or 2 decades, it's not that far away.
Excellent. Jim, your take?
Yeah, I totally agree with Bill. I'll just add one thing. You know, in the last 10 years, we really have realized that asthma is a syndrome. It's not one disease. You know, it's akin to anemia. There are multiple causes for anemia. And if you want to cure iron deficiency anemia, you take iron. You know, if there's a different type of anemia, there may be a totally different treatment for that. But by understanding that there are different types of asthma, we can really start to understand what causes those different types. And that, of course, is really the first step toward prevention. I think now we're recognizing different forms of asthma in children and in adults, and we have some good mechanisms to focus on to see if we can really prevent the disease. You know, all three of us have been at this for a long time, and, you know, prevention and more effective treatments are right around the corner. It's very exciting.
Dan, it's going to be tough batting cleanup on this one because those were pretty thoughtful, comprehensive answers, but anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I would echo what they've said, but I think that we're at a place right now that's really incredible from a technology standpoint as well. We have tools that are absolutely amazing to help us understand the different types of asthma and to identify those targetable pathways. We also have new medications, as Bill alluded to, that are extremely effective and life-changing for some patients with more severe disease. And just the opportunity to really take the right treatment to the right patient at the right time, I think, is where we are and where we're headed, and ultimately, hopefully, to precision prevention of disease as we move forward over the course of the next years.
Wow, well, thank you. It's wonderful to hear from 3 people that have shaped the history to date. What you see as a very encouraging and very optimistic future going forward with this. So I really appreciate each and all of you coming here to represent really one of the best traditions here at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. Well, in addition to thanking our outstanding expert panelists, I also want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us this evening, and thank you especially for your wonderful questions and for your active participation. I really hope you enjoyed tonight's program, and here comes the infomercial. I hope you'll continue to tune in for our next Wisconsin Medicine program, which is occurring on Wednesday, April 21st, and it will focus on addiction, a very important epidemic that continues to take lives and disrupt families and communities. If you wish, we'd be happy to have you sign up to receive emails, reminders, short infomercials, and also it will give you access to watch the greatest hits from some of our past sessions. So just log on to wiscmedicine.org. Thank you so much for your interest. Thank you for joining us. I look forward to seeing you again at future episodes. And until then, on Wisconsin. Good night.